Daddy needs his juice. Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to another how-to video. Today we'll be taking a look at something I've been meaning to bring to everyone for about a year now, and that is how to lay track. And today we'll be going over almost all aspects of laying track, from gluing it down to the roadbed to wiring it up to your layout. So a lot to get into, so hopefully you can get something out of this. Let's start off talking about track itself. There are a number of manufacturers. There's Atlas, there's Walthers, there's Microengineering, there's Pico. I've used most of these, and every single manufacturer is pretty darn good these days when it comes to turnouts and flex track and that kind of thing. There are a few things to look out for. I would suggest staying away from turnouts that use a plastic frog. And what I mean by that is, here's a turnout right here. This turnout has a metal frog that is isolated from the rest of the track. And what this means is I can wire this up so that this frog is electrified as the train passes through, and it helps with a lot of conductivity issues that motor tend to have. A lot of the issues you're going to have is around the frog of your turnout. So if you can get turnouts that have a metal frog that can be isolated and powered electrically, that's a great way to go. So let's go ahead and talk about laying the actual track itself. So we're going to pick up where we left off with last time with laying down the roadbed, and that is we're going to lay track in this general area here. We are going to lay the mainline track as well as the passing siding track. And what I want to do is I want to take a look at my area that I'm going to lay the track. I'm going to pick about 6 feet. I like to work in about 6 feet sections at a time. And this is because when I get to the gluing process, I don't want to have to rush my way through just to make sure that everything is glued down properly. We'll take a look at that once we get to that process. But I like to work in smaller sections. I like to go a little slower. I work slow anyway, but when it comes to track work, if you can kind of work slow, take your time with it, you're going to end up with better results overall. So that's what we're going to do here. So I'm going to lay track along my main line here, as well as my passing siding, and we're going to lay a couple of switches along the way. So we'll take a look at all that right now. The first thing we'll want to do is go ahead and measure out our locations for our turnouts. So I'll place the turnout on the cork in the spot where I think I want it to go. Well, where the spot where I'm pretty darn sure I want it to go anyway. And go ahead and mark it out. So what I like to do is I like to mark out the ends here. I like to mark out where I'm going to need to dig out a little channel for the clearance for the throw spring. And I'm going to mark out where I'm going to drill a hole for the wire that's going to power the frog. Once I do that, I can drill out the hole for that wire. And I can carve out my little trench for clearance around the spring. Once I've measured the turnout out on the layout, I bring it back to the benchwork here to do a little bit of work on it to get it ready to go back on the layout again. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this last tie here from the ends in order to give myself clearance for the rail joiner that will go on here later. So I just take these rail nippers here and just nip off the plastic off of the bottom side. Of each of these 3 ties. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to carve a little area out of this, the bottom side of this frog here. This is where I'm going to attach the wiring that will later power that frog. Now, on Microengineering track, you could just solder the wire to the side of the frog. I like to keep it a little bit cleaner around the frog, so I just go ahead and remove some of that plastic along the bottom and stick it on there. So I'm going to use this Dremel that has a round kind of rough file on the end there to go ahead and remove that plastic. And you can see I removed just enough to get the bare metal to show through there at the bottom. From here I use some green 22 gauge solid wire, and I prep that to solder onto the bottom. So first thing I do is I strip it using my wire stripper, and then I'm going to bend it into a bit of an L shape here on the end. Now we can get to soldering. I use a little bit of solder paste just to help kind of keep things flowing here on my frog. And I am using some 0.6 millimeter solder wire. This is just regular solder I bought off of Amazon. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tin the end of this wire. Tinning means you just add some solder to the end of that wire to get that ready to solder onto the frog. Next I add a little bit of solder to the frog itself to get that ready to accept the wire. And then finally I put the two together . I tested a little bit, I yank on it a little bit just to make sure it's not going to pop off. And it looks pretty solid on there. And so I am ready to go. With the prepared turnouts back on the layout, I can now lay everything in place and begin to measure out the flex track. I want to take my time with this step because I want to be careful that I'm measuring the flex track appropriately. If I measure it wrong and I cut it a little short, this flex track is basically not going to work, at least for this area. I'd have to use it on a different part of the layout. So taking my time, measuring carefully, and making sure that I get this right is a really good thing to do. I also sort of test fit everything together with rail joiners at this time. I'm using microengineering rail joiners. These are joiners that are from the same manufacturer and meant to work with the turnouts and flex track that I have here with me. Now that I've got my track cut out, trimmed, laid in place, I've got all my rail joiners ready to go. Everything is measured and looking great. It is now time to glue the track down to the cork. Now in previous years and previous layouts, I used Elmer's white glue, just plain old white glue to lay my track down. Works great, does a really great job, sets up nice and hard. My only real problem with it this time around was I wanted to try something a little different. So I tried what a lot of people had been suggesting, and that is DAP Alex Plus Clear silicone caulk, essentially. And this stuff is excellent. It holds extremely well, it dries clear, and it's a little bit flexible, which I think might actually help when it comes to you know, this track and when your lab kind of expands and contracts with humidity and weather and all that kind of stuff. I feel like having a little bit of flexibility there in the track might actually help. Now that may just be my brain, you know, playing tricks on me or whatever, but I can say it holds stuff down really well. And if I did need to pull the track up and remove it or replace it, it comes up much cleaner than it does with the white glue. The other thing is this was less than $2 for one of these. You can get a ton of glue for less than $2. There's nothing in model railroading these days that is that cheap. So I highly recommend this DAP Alex Plus Clear Silicone Caulk. Excellent stuff. So let's go ahead and apply it to the layout now. Once I get the glue spread out, I can come back here and lay down my track. I like to work from one end, and then as I'm laying down sections of track, move sort of in one direction, as opposed to laying down my switches maybe, and then trying to fit everything to it. That way I can make sure that things are lining up and butting up nicely, and that everything's flowing nicely as well. One thing I should mention as you're laying your track, you'll want to leave little gaps between pieces of track occasionally in your model railroad. Gaps don't need to be very large, maybe about the thickness of a credit card, and you'll want to do it every 3 to 6 feet. This will allow, as your track work expands from heat or contracts, as your humidity goes up and down and your bench work kind of moves around, this will keep your track a little more flexible. What could happen is if you got two pieces of track kind of pressing against each other, there's nowhere for it to move, and so the track will at some point kind of bow and kink, and you don't want that to kind of happen. So allowing these what's called expansion joints here will allow your track to expand and contract and remain nice and usable throughout all of the seasons. Don't solder your rail joiners at these points. Again, you want these track works to flex and move. So if you are considering soldering your track together, not at the points where you want to have the track expand or contract. Once you're happy with the placement of everything, you can start tacking it down. I use these push pins to do that. And just come at the track at an angle and start tacking it down. Another thing I like to do is sight down my track and see any areas that might be kind of moved out of position, tack those down first, make sure that they're in the correct position, and then tack everything else down after that. I've got all my pins in now, and the glue is starting to dry clear, which means it's starting to become a little unworkable. So I'm going to go ahead and walk away for a couple of hours and come back, and it should be done. One thing I'm going to do before I step away permanently, though, is occasionally I'll come back in here and I'll just wiggle my switch points just to make sure that I don't have any glue that's stopping those up, and I don't come back to any surprises and find that I've glued my switch points shut on my layout. I'll also take a cotton swab and clean up any excess glue. At this point, anything that's kind of squeezed out from between the ties, we can go ahead and clean it up at this point. As this glue dries, it's going to kind of contract and pull itself away from the top of the ties anyway. But cleaning it up a little bit more is going to make it look a little bit better and give us a little bit of an easier time once we get to ballasting. Alright, so once you've let the glue dry for about 8 hours, maybe overnight, or in my case, several weeks, I stepped away for a little while, but I'm back and finishing up this video. you can remove the thumbtacks, and you are ready to consider soldering track together and finishing up wiring and stuff and running a train. Before I get to any of that stuff, what I like to do is I just like to check to make sure that my track work is nice and aligned and everything looks okay. So I've got one of these National Model Railroad Association gauge. This just ensures that spacing between rails is correct. Sometimes, you know, under pressure you can bend something out of place. It can get a little funky. And another thing I do is I take some of my more problematic rolling stock and I just roll them through all the switch points and along all the rails. And I'm looking just to ensure that everything rolls smooth, nothing's kind of wobbling around on the turnouts or anything like that. And I always choose like my more problematic cars in order to do this. Now, if you don't know which ones your problematic cars are going to be, choose longer rolling stock. Connect those together, connect them together with a shorter piece of rolling stock. Choose some lighter rolling stock as well, something like a flat car that's going to get pulled off of the rails by other cars. And just roll them through your track work. You know, if it wobbles, it might be that a joint is not properly aligned, or maybe there's too much spacing between where two tracks come together, and you might need to fix that. You may need to take a file to some areas. Just look to make sure that everything is operating correctly. Now's the time to really be doing that before you get into scenery and you start laying down ballast and you know, grass and all the rest of that stuff, and then have to go back in and pull that out to fix an issue. Find the issues now and fix them. Even if it's like, it's working now, but I could see where that could be a problem in the future. Go ahead and fix it now. Anything you can do to get your track work running perfectly now, now is the time to do it, because track never gets better. It always gets a little worse. And if you can make it as good as possible now, now's the time to be doing that. In the past, I've done things like solder my turnouts to straight sections as well. When you have to replace a turnout, and at some point you probably will have to replace a turnout, having everything soldered together makes it just that much more difficult to get out. And so I don't find that there's really reason to solder straight sections together. If you've got things glued down well, once you lay down ballast and everything, nothing is going to move. You'll be all right in that regards. So once you've gotten everything sort of together and cars are rolling over it well, now's the time to wire it up and run a train. We'll get into wiring on Model Railroad in a different video. At this point, I just want to show you how to solder feeder wires to your track work, because it can be a little tricky. I'm terrible at soldering myself, so I'm not great at it, but I've learned a few tricks over the years that helps me out. So I will share those tricks with you today, and we'll solder this track together, and it'll be ready to go to run a train. At this point, I'm going to drill holes. Now, for wiring a feeder track, there's some different schools of thought. Some people like to wire directly beneath the track itself before you even lay the track down. I find that kind of just makes the track laying process more difficult. Some people like to wire your track work up away from the aisle, so as you solder on a piece of wire, you're soldering it onto the back side of the rail, which is fine for this outside track, but for this inside track, I'm not a great solderer, so I don't want anything that's going to obstruct the flanges of my cars and cause them to kind of bounce around as they hit them. So I always keep my wiring on the outside of my rails. And once you get it painted up and ballasted and scenery and looking nice, you're not going to notice those little wires being soldered up to the outside of the rail. What I'm going to do is just find a location and go ahead and drill some holes. So I'm going to drill a hole let's drill it right here. And one on the opposite side as well. Now I am drilling just wider than the wire that I plan on using itself. And this is so that as I go back through and I lay down ballast, I'm not losing any, I don't have these large holes I'm losing ballast down in. It only needs to be just as wide as the wire itself. And the wire I'm using is 22 gauge wire. So at this point, I've got some wire right here. I'm going to feed it up through the bottom of the layout through the holes I just drilled. There's the first wire, and here is the second wire. I'm going to pull them up and pull them up kind of, I've already got them wired into the main bus line at this point, so I don't need to worry about that. So I'm just going to kind of pull them up as far as I can. And I will leave a little bit of head height here and cut those a little bit shorter. And now I'm going to strip, oh, we'll say 1/4 of an inch-ish, maybe a little bit more than that, maybe a 1/2 inch of shielding around the wire. Now I'm using 22 gauge wire. Now at this point I am going to go ahead and then bend this wire so that it'll fit right along the edge of my rail. So the way I do that is I bend the wire, hopefully you can see that okay. I bend it in a bit of an L shape, an upside down L if you will, back in one direction. And then I bend the wire towards the track. So I've made an L shape out of the wire, and now I'm going to take the wire and I'm going to bend that L so that it's bent towards the track. So I've taken the L shape and bent it towards the track. And this will just help the wire kind of lay against the rail as I am soldering it in place. Now at this point I am ready to begin soldering, but first I want to do a couple of things. Now like I said before, I'm not great at soldering, so what I'm going to do is just show you some tips that I've learned over the years that help me out. I've soldered Trackwork for most of my life at this point, and I've used soldering practices and other hobbies and just electrical work around the house, and yet I still am not great at it. So the techniques I'm showing you here today are for people who aren't great at soldering. So first thing you'll want to do is lay down some paste. This is flux, actually, flux paste. I've seen liquid flux. I don't know if that works any better than this pasty stuff. This is just, I've used this for years and it seems to work okay. Now what flux does is it just allows the solder to flow a little bit better. So I just tap my wire a little bit and then I tap the rails a little bit with it. So I just turn my soldering iron up to hot, basically up super high. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tin the wires, which means I'm going to take a little solder and I'm going to apply it to the wires prior to soldering those wires to my Trackwork. And the reason I do that is because it just makes it a little bit easier once you get down there. You've got solder on your wire already. You don't need to worry about applying the wire to the rail and then the solder to the wire, and having the wire pre-tinned makes things just much easier. Once I've done that, I can then pull my wire down and then place it flush with the rail itself. Now here's another tip that I sort of stumbled across. I don't know if I saw this from someone or if I came up with this idea myself. We'll say I came up with myself. I'm sure somebody else has shown this before. These are alligator clips connected to a piece of wire that you would use to sort of, my soldering kit kind of came with these, but you would use it to hold parts. What I'm going to do is I'm going to place the wire, or this alligator clip, right next to where I'm going to solder the wire to the rail. And what that does is, because I'm such a terrible solderer, I kind of have to hold the soldering iron against the Trackwork for too long in order for it to for the joint to hold. And by doing that, I'm running the risk of melting the plastic ties. By placing this alligator clip on the rail, what it does is it takes the heat from the rail and it travels up into the alligator clip as opposed to the plastic tie itself, because metal is a much better conductor of heat than plastic is. That heat will travel up into the alligator clip, saving my plastic ties. I have melted so many plastic ties in my life. I wish I knew about this tip much earlier than now. But I've been using it on this model railroad, and I can tell you I have not lost a single tie since I started using it on this layout. I'm very, very excited about that. So we've got the wire pulled down and kind of stuck into place. We're now going to apply some heat to that little bit of solder that I've already pre-tinned onto the rail. And I'm pulling down from the bottom at the same time just to make sure that my wire's not like sticking up too far. Once I get it on there, now it's on there, it's stuck on there, but I don't have a ton of solder on the wire itself. So I'm going to add a little more solder at this point. Now I tend to over solder my rails just because, again, I'm not great at soldering, and I just want to make sure that's on there. So once I've added some more solder, it kind of flows nicely into place there, and it looks really good. And what I'm looking for is a nice, smooth, shiny joint. And if it is shiny, I know that that is a good solid joint between the wire and the rail. If it's kind of dull and if it's kind of rough looking, that means that that joint is what's called a cold joint, and it just means that your solder hasn't gotten hot enough, and a cold joint runs the risk of breaking at that point, and you don't want that to happen. Now again, like I said, once this thing is, once the track is weathered and painted and you got ballast down, you're not going to really notice that joint. But what you can do is you can take a little, I've got a little round file here, and I kind of just run it along here, and I'll clean up that solder joint a little bit, and I'll maybe push the wire kind of down a little bit and get a little more out of the way. I can take a bright boy and kind of clean up the tops of the rails. And there we go, looking pretty great. And that's about it. I could keep talking about Trackwork forever, but essentially that's everything you need to know in order to get track laid down and get to running trains. If I can say anything at this point, it would be take your time, do it right. If you don't do right the first time, not a big deal. Trackwork is fairly inexpensive. You can go back in and you can fix it with another piece of track. Do that part of it now before you go laying down scenery, because like I said, like maybe the worst part of this hobby is when you've got a great looking model railroad, but you keep derailing over one spot, and so you're never able to really enjoy your model railroad because you're always worried about, like, oh, when's the next time my train's going to derail? You're like, oh, I hate this one spot right here. So, you know, take your time, get it done right. If it's not good enough, now's the time to go back and fix it, and you'll be really happy that you did. Thanks for sticking around for this video, and hopefully you got something out of it. And yeah, I'll see you all in another video.